On a crisp fall morning in the quiet town of Maplewood, the Parker family was going about their usual weekend routine when something curious caught 8-year-old Emily's eye. Through the large bay window of their cozy suburban home, she saw a small squirrel darting across the yard, its fluffy tail twitching erratically. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. Squirrels were common in the neighborhood, often chasing each other up trees or scavenging for food under the thick canopy of oak leaves that carpeted the lawn. But today, this particular squirrel behaved differently. Clutched in its tiny paws was a single acorn, which it carried not to the base of a tree or a secretive burrow as Emily expected, but directly to their front porch. "Mom! Dad! Come look at this!" Emily called out, pressing her face against the glass as her breath fogged up the window. Her mother, Laura, glanced over from where she stood at the kitchen counter preparing breakfast, while her father, Tom, looked up from his newspaper, intrigued by his daughter's excitement. "What is it, sweetie?" Laura asked, wiping her hands on a towel and joining her daughter at the window. She followed Emily's gaze, and sure enough, there was the squirrel, now perched on the doorstep, carefully depositing the acorn by the doormat. Tom chuckled, setting his newspaper down. "Looks like he's leaving us a little present," he mused, shaking his head. "Maybe it's his way of saying thanks for the birdseed." The family had a bird feeder in the backyard, and over the years, several squirrels had become uninvited guests, stealing seeds from the feeder whenever they could. It wasn't uncommon for them to see a squirrel around, but none of them had ever delivered something to the house like this before. The small squirrel lingered for a moment, as if ensuring the acorn was placed just right before scurrying off, its small, nimble legs carrying it up the nearest tree in a flash of fur. Emily giggled, finding the whole thing amusing, but her parents thought little of it. Squirrels, after all, were known for their quirky behaviors. They assumed this would be the last they saw of the little creature. However, the next morning, the scene repeated itself. As the family prepared for another day, Emily once again noticed the squirrel bounding across the lawn, another acorn gripped tightly in its paws. This time, she watched more closely as the squirrel made its way to the exact same spot on the porch, placing the acorn neatly beside the first, which they hadn't moved from the previous day. "Mom! Dad! The squirrel's back, and it brought another acorn!" Emily shouted excitedly, now fully invested in the peculiar behavior of the furry visitor. Laura and Tom exchanged a puzzled glance as they walked over to the window, joining Emily. "You don't see that every day," Laura said with a slight frown. "It's strange, though. Why would it keep leaving acorns here? Usually, squirrels bury them for winter." Tom shrugged, stepping outside to examine the acorns more closely. They looked ordinary enough, small, brown, with a smooth surface and a neat little cap still attached. He knelt down, picking one up and examining it in the sunlight, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Yet the fact that the same squirrel had returned to the same doorstep 2 days in a row was undeniably odd. "I'm sure it's nothing," Tom reassured his family as he placed the acorn back on the porch. "Just a quirky little guy with an unusual habit." But by the third morning, when the squirrel returned yet again, the family couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was going on. This time, the tiny creature didn't just bring another acorn, it brought a small bundle of dried leaves with it as well, carefully placing them beside the acorns before skittering away. Now, even Tom couldn't dismiss the squirrel's actions as mere coincidence. "Okay, that's definitely weird," he muttered, standing at the window with his arms crossed. "Why does it keep coming back? And why is it leaving things on our porch?" Laura nodded in agreement, her brow furrowed in concern. "It's like it's trying to communicate with us. But why? What could a squirrel possibly want from us?" Emily, meanwhile, was more fascinated than ever. She had always loved animals, and this squirrel's behavior only made her more curious. "Maybe he's trying to tell us something," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Maybe he needs our help." Tom laughed lightly at his daughter's imagination, but a part of him couldn't help but feel unsettled. There was something about the way the squirrel behaved, the deliberate nature of its actions, that left him with a gnawing sense of unease. Squirrels didn't just leave acorns on doorsteps for no reason. The following day, when the squirrel arrived again, its tiny paws gripping a fresh acorn and a shiny object that glinted in the morning sun, the mystery deepened. This time, Tom was ready. He had been watching from the window, waiting to see what the squirrel would do. As the animal approached the porch, it carefully deposited its acorn and the shiny object, what looked like a small coin or button, beside the growing pile before scampering off into the trees once more. "Did you see that?" Tom asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "It left something else this time." Laura rushed to the door, with Emily following closely behind. The shiny object caught their attention immediately. It wasn't an acorn or a bundle of leaves, but a small metal token, slightly tarnished with age, but still reflective. Laura picked it up, turning it over in her hands as Emily looked on in awe. "What is it, Mom?" Emily asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. "I'm not sure," Laura admitted, examining the object closely. It appeared to have some sort of engraving on it, though the letters were faint, almost worn away by time. "It looks old, like it's been out here for years." Tom joined them on the porch, looking down at the growing collection of acorns and now the mysterious metal token. His brow furrowed in thought as he considered the implications of the squirrel's actions. "Maybe it found this in the yard," he suggested, though even he didn't sound convinced. "But why would it bring it to us?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. The Parker family had never seen anything like this before, and their once quiet mornings had turned into a daily ritual of observing their curious visitor. The squirrel's behavior had become more deliberate with each passing day, as if it was trying to communicate something important, something that the family just couldn't understand, yet. As the days went on, the squirrel's visits continued, and each time it brought a new offering: acorns, leaves, twigs, and occasionally another shiny object, like a small key or a rusted coin. The collection on the Parkers' porch grew, and with it, so did the mystery. Laura and Tom began to wonder if there was more to this strange behavior than they had initially thought. What could the squirrel be trying to tell them? Why their house, and why now? Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Tom decided to do some research. Late one evening, after Emily had gone to bed, he sat down at his computer and typed in a few search terms: squirrel leaving objects on porch, squirrel behavior, and animals delivering things to humans. He scrolled through articles and forums, but nothing seemed to match what they were experiencing. Just as he was about to give up, an old blog post caught his eye. The article was written by a wildlife expert who had spent years studying animal behavior, and one of the stories mentioned a man who had experienced something remarkably similar to what was happening to the Parkers. According to the blog, certain animals, especially those that had developed a strong bond with humans, were known to exhibit behaviors that seemed to transcend mere survival instincts. They might leave gifts, small tokens of food or objects, as a form of communication or tribute. In some rare cases, these animals had been known to carry out the same routine year after year, often in memory of a human who had once cared for them. Tom's pulse quickened as he read the story. Could it be possible that this squirrel was somehow connected to the history of their house, or perhaps to someone who had lived here before them? He called Laura over, and together they read the blog post, their curiosity growing with each paragraph. The idea seemed far-fetched, but it was the only explanation that made sense. The squirrel's behavior was too deliberate, too consistent to be random. The next morning, when the squirrel returned yet again, Tom and Laura decided to take a closer look at their property. Something had triggered this behavior, and they were determined to find out what. As the days went by, the squirrel's behavior became more and more difficult for the Parker family to ignore. At first, it had seemed like a charming quirk of nature, something to tell friends about over coffee or to laugh at while watching from the kitchen window. The tiny creature, with its bushy tail and bright eyes, would scurry up to their porch every morning, carefully place a single acorn at their doorstep, and dart off before anyone could come outside. It was the type of thing that might inspire a children's book or a viral video, a cute, if slightly odd, ritual from a determined little animal. But what had initially seemed charming was quickly becoming unsettling. Every morning, without fail, the squirrel appeared with a fresh acorn. At first, the family had shrugged it off as an odd but harmless routine. After all, animals could be strange sometimes, and maybe this was just how this particular squirrel was wired. Maybe it had a habit of stockpiling acorns and had simply chosen their porch as a convenient storage place. However, after the third day in a row, when the squirrel arrived just as the sun was peeking over the horizon, the Parkers couldn't help but exchange glances. "Does it seem like that squirrel is targeting us specifically?" Mrs. Parker asked one morning as she sipped her coffee, watching the little creature scamper away once more. Her husband, flipping through the newspaper at the table, shrugged. "Animals are weird," he said, though his brow furrowed slightly. "Maybe it just likes our porch." Their two children, Lizzie and Tommy, were more fascinated than concerned. They started to wait by the window each morning, eager to see the squirrel make its daily delivery. "Look, there it is again." Lizzie squealed as the squirrel approached with yet another acorn clutched in its tiny paws. "Maybe it's bringing us a gift," Tommy said with a grin, as if they were the chosen recipients of some squirrely offering. The acorns began to pile up. Each morning, there was a fresh one sitting at the foot of the door, perfectly placed. Mrs. Parker began collecting them in a small bowl by the window, unsure of what else to do with them. "We could make a wreath or something," she joked one afternoon, holding up the bowl full of acorns. But her voice was tinged with a note of concern. The whole thing was starting to feel deliberate. As if the squirrel wasn't just randomly dropping acorns, but had a specific reason for doing so. What was once an amusing occurrence was now veering into the territory of the bizarre. What exactly was this tiny creature trying to communicate? On the sixth morning, Mr. Parker decided to intervene. He had watched the squirrel approach the porch again, another acorn in its mouth, and he stood by the door waiting. As the squirrel got closer, Mr. Parker opened the door and stepped outside, hoping to shoo the animal away and end the strange ritual once and for all. But instead of being scared off, the squirrel stopped in its tracks and stared at him with an intensity that made Mr. Parker pause. The two stood there for a moment, locked in a silent standoff. The squirrel's tiny body was rigid, its eyes wide and fixed on Mr. Parker, the acorn still clutched in its mouth. For a brief moment, he had the eerie feeling that the animal was waiting for something, expecting something. "Go on, get out of here," Mr. Parker muttered, waving his hand to scare the squirrel away. But the creature didn't move. Instead, it carefully placed the acorn on the ground and scampered off, as it had done every morning before. Mr. Parker stood frozen for a moment, watching the squirrel disappear into the bushes at the edge of the yard. He couldn't shake the odd feeling that had crept over him during the encounter. What had just happened? Why hadn't the squirrel run away when he approached? Was it really just some instinctual behavior, or was there something more going on? That evening at dinner, the Parkers discussed the squirrel for the first time with a sense of genuine unease. "It's been doing this for almost a week now," Mrs. Parker said, her voice low. "Every single morning, like clockwork. I don't know why, but it's starting to creep me out a little." "It's definitely weird," Mr. Parker admitted, pushing his food around on his plate. "This morning, I tried to scare it off, but it just stood there. Almost like it was waiting for me to do something." The children, of course, were still more excited than worried. "Maybe it thinks we're its family," Tommy said, his face lighting up at the thought. "Maybe it's bringing us acorns because it wants to live with us." Lizzie giggled at the idea, but Mrs. Parker wasn't so sure. "I don't think this is just a random thing," she said. "There's something intentional about it. And that squirrel is way too comfortable around us. It's like it knows something we don't." The conversation left an uncomfortable feeling hanging in the air. That night, Mrs. Parker couldn't stop thinking about the squirrel. Lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, her mind raced with questions. Was it possible that the squirrel was trying to communicate something? But what? And why their house? The following morning, things took an even stranger turn. As usual, the squirrel appeared on the porch just after sunrise. But this time, when Mrs. Parker opened the door to retrieve the acorn, she noticed something odd. Along with the acorn, there was something shiny lying next to it, a small, metallic object half buried in the dirt. "What in the world?" she muttered, bending down to pick it up. At first, she thought it might be a coin, but as she wiped away the dirt, she realized it was something else entirely. It was a small, rusted key. Mrs. Parker's heart skipped a beat. Why on earth would a squirrel bring a key to their porch? And where had it found something like this? She turned the key over in her hand, examining it closely. It was old, clearly worn with age, and had a faint engraving on the side that was too faded to read clearly. She called for her husband, her voice tinged with excitement and fear. "David, come look at this." Mr. Parker hurried over, his eyes widening when he saw the key. "What the hell?" he muttered, taking it from her and examining it himself. "Where did this come from?" "The squirrel," Mrs. Parker said, her voice shaking slightly. "It left it here with the acorn." They stood there for a moment, both of them staring down at the key in Mr. Parker's hand, the weight of the situation sinking in. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. This wasn't just some cute animal behavior anymore, this was something much stranger. Over the next few days, the key became the focus of their curiosity. The squirrel continued to show up each morning, but now, the Parkers couldn't stop wondering about the mysterious object it had left behind. Where had it found the key? And why leave it for them? The more they thought about it, the more questions surfaced. Mrs. Parker tried to clean the key, hoping to reveal the engraving, but it was too worn to make out clearly. Mr. Parker joked that maybe the squirrel was leading them on some kind of treasure hunt, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more serious going on. The children, too, had noticed a shift in their parents' attitudes. "Why is everyone acting so weird about the squirrel?" Lizzie asked one afternoon as she sat on the porch, waiting for the next acorn delivery. "It's just a squirrel." But even Lizzie, young as she was, could sense that there was something different now. The squirrel had stopped being just a cute visitor and had become a mystery, a puzzle that the whole family was trying to solve. By the end of the week, the tension in the household had risen to a palpable level. Every time the squirrel appeared, the family gathered at the window, watching with bated breath to see if it would bring another object. But after the key, the squirrel seemed to return to its usual routine, leaving only acorns. Despite the lack of new developments, the family couldn't shake their sense of unease. What had started as a simple curiosity was now something much deeper, a feeling that they were on the edge of discovering something important, something hidden just beneath the surface of their everyday lives. And then, one morning, everything changed. The squirrel didn't come. For the first time in over a week, there was no acorn waiting at the doorstep. No tiny creature scurrying up to their porch. The absence of the squirrel, so sudden and unexpected, left a hollow feeling in the pit of Mrs. Parker's stomach. She hadn't realized how much she had come to expect the squirrel's visits until they stopped. The family gathered at the front door, staring out at the empty porch. The sun had risen, but there was no sign of the squirrel. "What do you think happened to it?" Lizzie asked, her voice small and worried. Mr. Parker shook his head, his eyes scanning the yard for any sign of movement. "I don't know," he said quietly. But deep down, they all knew that something had shifted. Whatever mystery the squirrel had been trying to reveal was still out there, unanswered. And now, without the squirrel to guide them, they were left to wonder what it all meant. One crisp autumn morning, the Parker family was going about their usual weekend routine. The sun filtered through the bright yellow and orange leaves that blanketed their front yard. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, bringing with it the scent of earth and pine needles. Inside the house, Mr. Parker was flipping pancakes while his wife, Melissa, prepared coffee. Their daughter, Emily, sat at the kitchen table, tapping away on her tablet. It was an ordinary day in every respect, except for one thing. For the past 2 weeks, a tiny squirrel had visited their doorstep every morning, leaving an acorn in the exact same spot. At first, it seemed like a curious, harmless occurrence, just another quirk of nature. The family had joked about it, assuming the squirrel was simply storing food for the winter or engaging in some oddball squirrel behavior. But as the days passed, the family began to realize that there was something peculiar about the squirrel's dedication. The acorns were always perfectly placed in the center of the welcome mat, and the squirrel never seemed to miss a day. On this particular morning, Melissa noticed something different when she opened the door to retrieve the mail. She saw the familiar little squirrel sitting on the step, clutching its usual acorn in its tiny paws. But instead of scampering off after depositing the nut, the squirrel stayed put, its beady eyes fixed on her. Melissa, intrigued, crouched down to watch the squirrel more closely. "Look at this little guy," she called to her family. "He's not running away today. He's just sitting here like he's waiting for something." Mr. Parker walked over, wiping his hands on a kitchen towel, and peered out the door. "Maybe he wants a tip," he joked. But as he leaned in closer, his playful expression faded into a look of surprise. Next to the acorn, there was something else. A small, shiny object was sitting on the doorstep, glinting in the morning sun. It was no bigger than a coin, and from a distance, it was hard to tell exactly what it was. Mr. Parker opened the screen door cautiously, making sure not to startle the squirrel, which remained seated, uncharacteristically calm. "What is that?" Melissa asked, standing up and stepping forward, her curiosity piqued. "I don't know," Mr. Parker replied, his brow furrowed. He bent down to pick up the object, glancing warily at the squirrel as if asking its permission. The squirrel didn't move, only tilted its head slightly, as if watching their every motion with unusual focus. As Mr. Parker retrieved the object, he realized it wasn't just some piece of random debris. It was an old, worn keychain, the kind with an engraved tag. The metal was tarnished, and there were scratches across the surface, but something about it seemed familiar. He rubbed his thumb across the engravings, trying to make sense of the faded lettering. "Wait a second," he muttered, holding the keychain up to the light. "I think this belonged to the old man who used to live here." Melissa's eyes widened in recognition. The previous owner, Mr. Grant, had lived in their house for nearly 50 years before passing away about a year ago. The Parkers had bought the house shortly after his death, but they didn't know much about him, just that he had been a quiet, elderly man who lived alone. Rumor had it that he loved animals, particularly the squirrels in his yard. The keychain bore the initials JG, unmistakably identifying it as belonging to Mr. Grant. Beneath the initials was a small, intricate engraving of an oak tree, its branches twisting and intertwining in an elaborate pattern. "Do you think the squirrel brought this?" Melissa asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I don't know," Mr. Parker said, shaking his head slowly. "But it was definitely sitting right next to the acorn, and I don't see how else it could have gotten here." They both turned their gaze to the squirrel, which remained rooted to the spot, its small paws clasped in front of its chest. It blinked slowly, as if waiting for something. A sense of unease began to creep over the couple. This was no ordinary squirrel behavior. Melissa took a step back. "This is weird," she said. "I mean, squirrels don't just bring things like this. Do you think it could be a coincidence?" Mr. Parker didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the keychain, his mind racing. How could a squirrel have found something so specific, something that had belonged to the previous owner of the house, and brought it to their doorstep? He turned the keychain over in his hand, noticing more scratches along the edges, as if it had been buried or hidden somewhere for a long time. "It can't be a coincidence," he finally said. "This squirrel has been leaving acorns here every day for 2 weeks, and now, all of a sudden, it shows up with something that belonged to Mr. Grant? That's not random." At that moment, Emily, who had been eavesdropping from the kitchen, joined her parents at the door. "What's going on?" she asked, peeking over her dad's shoulder to get a look at the squirrel. "We're trying to figure out why this squirrel keeps leaving stuff on our doorstep," Melissa explained. "It just left an old keychain, and we think it belonged to Mr. Grant." Emily, intrigued, leaned in closer. "That's so cool," she said. "Maybe the squirrel is trying to tell us something." Melissa laughed nervously. What could a squirrel possibly be trying to tell us? I don't know, Emily said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. But animals are smarter than we think. Maybe this one remembers Mr. Grant, and it's trying to show us something important. Mr. Parker, still holding the keychain, glanced down at the squirrel again. The little creature had finally moved, but only to pick up another acorn from the base of the porch. It held the acorn in its paws, staring up at them as if waiting for their next move. I think Emily might be right, Mr. Parker said quietly. I've heard stories about animals having strong memories, especially with people who feed them regularly. Maybe Mr. Grant used to feed this squirrel, and now it's trying to communicate with us in some way. Melissa frowned, still unconvinced. That's a pretty big leap, don't you think? It might be, Mr. Parker admitted. But I can't think of any other explanation. Squirrels don't just leave things like this at random, and they definitely don't bring back objects that belong to people. The family stood in silence for a few moments, contemplating the bizarre situation. The squirrel, now with an acorn in its mouth, finally scurried off the porch and darted across the yard, disappearing into the bushes. Mr. Parker pocketed the keychain and turned to his family. Let's do some digging, he said. There's got to be a reason why this squirrel is so focused on our house, and I think it has something to do with Mr. Grant. Over the next few days, the Parker family became amateur detectives, determined to uncover the mystery behind the squirrel's behavior. They began by researching the history of their home and its previous owner. Melissa reached out to some of the older neighbors who had known Mr. Grant, hoping to find clues about his connection to the animals in the neighborhood. One afternoon, Melissa spoke with Mrs. Thompson, a woman in her late 70s who had lived next door to Mr. Grant for decades. Over a cup of tea, Mrs. Thompson shared stories about Mr. Grant's love for the local wildlife. Oh, yes, dear, Mrs. Thompson said, her voice soft and nostalgic. Mr. Grant was always feeding the animals. He had a soft spot for the squirrels in particular. Used to sit out on his porch every morning with a handful of nuts, waiting for them to come down from the trees. They'd eat right out of his hand, you know. Melissa's eyes widened. So, you think one of those squirrels might be the one coming to our house now? Mrs. Thompson nodded. I wouldn't be surprised. Squirrels have excellent memories, especially when it comes to food. If that little guy remembers Mr. Grant, it might be coming back because it associates your house with him. Melissa left the conversation feeling more convinced than ever that the squirrel's behavior was not random. When she relayed the information to her family that evening, they agreed it was time to dig deeper into the connection between Mr. Grant and the squirrel. Emily suggested they look around the yard, particularly near the base of the large oak tree that stood in the corner of the property. It had been Mr. Grant's favorite tree, according to the neighbors, and he had spent hours sitting under it, feeding the squirrels and watching the birds. The next morning, armed with a small garden trowel and a flashlight, the family began their search. As they dug near the roots of the oak tree, they noticed something peculiar, a small, shallow hole, just big enough to fit an acorn. Inside, they found a few acorns carefully placed in a neat little pile, as if the squirrel had been leaving them there for safekeeping. But that wasn't all. Buried a little deeper, they uncovered something unexpected, a small, weathered box, its edges covered in dirt and moss. Inside the box was a collection of trinkets, including another keychain, a set of old dog tags, and a photograph of Mr. Grant sitting on his porch, a squirrel perched on his knee. The family stared at the contents of the box in shock. The squirrel hadn't just been leaving acorns, it had been leading them to something. Something Mr. Grant had buried long ago, perhaps as a memory of the animals he had cared for so deeply. As they stood there, piecing together the mystery, the little squirrel reappeared, hopping across the yard with yet another acorn in its mouth. It dropped the acorn at their feet, as if to say, "Here, this is for you." The next morning, just like clockwork, the Parker family once again found the tiny squirrel sitting on their doorstep, another acorn placed carefully near the front door. By now, the family was used to this strange daily occurrence, but something about this morning felt different. As Mr. Parker stood at the window watching the squirrel hop away after dropping off its little delivery, his attention was drawn to something glinting in the early morning sunlight. It was not just an acorn this time. There was something else lying next to it. Curiosity piqued, Mr. Parker quickly threw on his slippers and headed outside. He bent down to retrieve the acorn, but his eyes were fixed on the small, shiny object lying beside it. Picking it up, he realized it was a small metal trinket, worn and weathered as though it had been buried or hidden for some time. As he turned it over in his hand, he noticed faint engravings etched into its surface. They were hard to make out due to the years of exposure to the elements, but there was no mistaking that this was no random piece of metal. It looked like some kind of tag, or perhaps a piece of jewelry. Confused and intrigued, Mr. Parker brought the object inside to show his wife and children. Mrs. Parker examined the trinket closely. It was small, almost insignificant at first glance, but the engraving gave it an air of importance. There were faint numbers, barely readable, and what seemed to be initials at the bottom. The Parkers exchanged curious glances. Was this object connected to the squirrel's behavior? Why would a squirrel, of all things, bring something like this to their home? The mystery deepened. Over breakfast, the family speculated wildly about the origins of the small metal tag. Was it part of something lost long ago? Did it belong to someone who had lived in the house before them? What was the connection between the squirrel and this mysterious object? Mr. Parker suggested that perhaps the squirrel had found it while foraging and decided to leave it as an offering, just as it had been bringing acorns for the past few weeks. But that theory didn't sit right with him. The squirrel's behavior was too deliberate, too purposeful. It was as if the animal was trying to tell them something. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Mrs. Parker suggested that they do some research. Maybe we can figure out where this tag came from, she said, holding it up to the light. There has to be some significance behind it. The family agreed, and they began their investigation. They started by looking into the history of their house, thinking that perhaps the tag was somehow connected to a previous owner. Mr. Parker recalled that when they had moved in, the real estate agent had mentioned that the house had once belonged to an older gentleman who had lived there for decades. The agent had said the man passed away peacefully in his sleep, leaving behind no immediate family. He had been something of a recluse in his later years, but the neighbors had always spoken highly of him, describing him as a kind soul who loved nature and the wildlife that frequented the area. Mrs. Parker took to the computer, searching for any records of the previous owner or any mention of strange behavior involving animals. She found little at first, just some old property records and a few mentions of the man's quiet life in the neighborhood. But then, in an old neighborhood forum, she stumbled across a post from years ago, written by a former neighbor. The post described how the old man, Mr. Alcott, had a special relationship with the local wildlife. He would sit on his porch every morning, feeding birds, squirrels, and other creatures that ventured into his yard. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. The post mentioned how the animals, particularly a small family of squirrels, seemed to recognize him and return to his yard year after year, as if they shared a bond with him. The Parkers were intrigued. Could this squirrel be one of the descendants of the squirrels Mr. Alcott had cared for? It seemed far-fetched, but it was the only lead they had. The connection between the squirrel's behavior and the mysterious tag remained unclear, but the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Later that day, Mr. Parker decided to ask some of the neighbors if they knew anything more about Mr. Alcott. He hoped to find someone who might remember something that could explain the squirrel's odd behavior. At first, the neighbors didn't offer much beyond what the Parkers already knew, that Mr. Alcott had been a quiet man who kept mostly to himself, but was known for his love of animals. However, one elderly neighbor, Mrs. Donnelly, recalled something that piqued Mr. Parker's interest. "I remember Alcott used to wear this little medallion on a chain around his neck," Mrs. Donnelly said, squinting as she tried to remember. "He said it was something from his time in the service. I think it had some initials on it. He was very protective of it, though he never talked much about his past." Mr. Parker's heart raced. Could the tag they found be connected to Mr. Alcott's past? Perhaps the squirrel had somehow found the medallion and brought it to their doorstep, continuing the bond between Alcott and the animals even after his passing. The Parkers returned home with renewed energy. They needed to find out more about Mr. Alcott's life, especially his time in the service. If the medallion was military in origin, it might explain the engravings on it. That night, they scoured the internet for any mention of Alcott's military service, but it wasn't until Mrs. Parker checked an online veterans database that they found a match. Mr. Alcott had served in the military during the Korean War. His records confirmed that he had been awarded a small medallion for his bravery during the conflict, but the details of his service remained shrouded in mystery. The Parkers stared at the screen in awe. They had found a connection, but it still didn't explain why the squirrel had brought the medallion to their door. What could this animal possibly know about the object's importance? Why did it feel compelled to deliver the medallion, just as it had been delivering acorns? The next morning, the squirrel returned, but this time, it lingered longer than usual. Instead of hopping away after dropping the acorn, it sat on the porch, watching the Parker family through the window. Its small black eyes seemed to hold a strange intelligence, as if it were waiting for something. Mrs. Parker, growing more convinced that the squirrel was trying to communicate, slowly opened the door and stepped outside. The squirrel didn't run. It simply looked up at her, and for a moment, there was a silent understanding between them. Carefully, Mrs. Parker placed the medallion on the ground, beside the acorn the squirrel had brought. The squirrel glanced at it, then back at Mrs. Parker, before cautiously approaching the medallion. It sniffed the small object, then, to the Parkers' surprise, it picked it up in its tiny paws and carried it back into the bushes where it had come from. The family watched in amazement as the squirrel disappeared into the foliage, the medallion in tow. For the rest of the day, the Parkers couldn't stop talking about what had happened. Why had the squirrel taken the medallion back? Did it think the Parkers weren't worthy of it? Or was it simply returning the object to where it belonged? The mystery deepened, and the Parkers were left with more questions than answers. Later that evening, as the family sat together discussing the events of the past few days, Mrs. Parker suggested they try following the squirrel to see where it was taking the medallion. "Maybe there's something more to this," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "What if it's leading us to something important?" The next morning, they prepared a small stakeout, sitting by the window with binoculars and a camera, hoping to catch a glimpse of where the squirrel was going with the medallion. Sure enough, just after dawn, the squirrel returned, scurrying across the yard with the medallion still clutched in its paws. The Parkers watched as it darted towards the large oak tree at the edge of their property, disappearing into a small hole at the base of the trunk. The family exchanged puzzled looks. What was hidden inside that tree? Why had the squirrel chosen this spot to hide the medallion? With their curiosity at an all-time high, they decided to investigate further. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of adventure, Mr. Parker knelt down by the tree and peered into the hole. Inside, he saw a small collection of objects, acorns, bits of leaves, and, in the center, the medallion. But there was something else there, too. Something small and wrapped in old, tattered cloth. Carefully, Mr. Parker reached inside and pulled it out. The cloth fell away to reveal a small wooden box, intricately carved with a design that looked ancient and worn. Inside the box was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Mrs. Parker unfolded the paper carefully, her hands trembling slightly. The writing was faded, but still legible. It was a letter, dated over 60 years ago, addressed to Mr. Alcott. The letter spoke of a deep friendship between Alcott and a fellow soldier, a bond formed during the war. The medallion had been a gift from his friend, a token of gratitude for saving his life. The letter ended with a poignant request: "If I don't make it back, promise me you'll give this to someone who will appreciate it." The Parkers sat in stunned silence. The squirrel, whether by chance or some inexplicable bond, had delivered the medallion to them, completing a promise made decades ago. The mystery was solved, but it left them with a profound sense of wonder. Somehow, in a way none of them could fully explain, the squirrel had been part of something much bigger than any of them had realized. From that day on, the Parker family never looked at their small visitor the same way. The acorns, once a source of confusion, now felt like a reminder of the bond between man and nature, a connection that transcended time and understanding. The squirrel continued to visit, but now it was a welcome guest, a messenger of the past, and a reminder of the mysteries that sometimes lie just beyond our understanding. As the mystery of the squirrel's odd behavior unfolded, the Parker family grew more intrigued. The once casual morning ritual of watching the tiny squirrel drop off its acorn at their doorstep had evolved into a full-scale investigation into the animal's intentions. And now, the pieces were starting to come together. The turning point came when Mrs. Parker had a casual conversation with her elderly neighbor, Mr. Thompson, during one of the squirrel's visits. Mr. Thompson had lived on the street for decades and had seen families come and go, including the previous owner of the Parker home. He casually mentioned how much the previous owner, Mr. Albright, loved animals, especially the local squirrels. He used to feed them all the time, Mr. Thompson said, his voice warm with nostalgia. He'd leave little bits of food out every morning, nuts, fruits, and sometimes even vegetables. It was like his own personal squirrel buffet. He had a special bond with them. This revelation was like a lightning strike to Mrs. Parker. Could it be that the squirrel was one of Mr. Albright's loyal companions, returning to repay some sort of debt? Was it possible that this little creature had an emotional attachment to the previous homeowner and was now trying to continue the routine it once shared with him? These thoughts swirled in her mind, sparking a wave of curiosity that quickly spread to the rest of the family. The next day, when the squirrel made its appearance, Mrs. Parker decided to follow it. The creature scurried down the driveway, clutching another acorn in its tiny paws, moving with purpose. Mrs. Parker trailed behind cautiously, careful not to startle it. The squirrel darted into the side yard and disappeared into a small patch of woods at the edge of the property. Curious, Mrs. Parker moved closer, crouching down to watch where the squirrel was going. To her surprise, she saw it burrow into a small hole in the ground, a hidden nook she had never noticed before. The hole wasn't just any old animal burrow, it seemed deliberate, almost like a storage spot. Mrs. Parker's curiosity heightened as she waited for the squirrel to emerge. After a few moments, it popped back out, leaving the acorn behind and scampering off into the trees. Mrs. Parker, now feeling like an amateur detective, decided to investigate. She waited until the squirrel was out of sight, then carefully approached the spot. Gently brushing aside the leaves, she found the acorn, just as she expected. But there was something else beneath it. A faint glimmer caught her eye. She reached into the burrow, her fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. It was the same shiny object that the squirrel had left on their doorstep earlier, the one with engravings on it that none of them had been able to make sense of. Mrs. Parker carefully pulled it out and examined it more closely. Upon further inspection, the engraving appeared to be a name, faded and worn over time, but still legible, J. Albright. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a shiny trinket, it was something deeply personal. This wasn't just a random item the squirrel had found and dropped off. It was something that belonged to Mr. Albright himself, the previous owner of their house. And it had been left by the squirrel as if it were delivering a message. That evening, Mrs. Parker gathered the family around the dinner table and presented her findings. "I think this squirrel belonged to Mr. Albright," she began, holding up the shiny object for everyone to see. "This was his. I'm sure of it." The rest of the family stared at the object in disbelief. Mr. Parker leaned in closer, adjusting his glasses. "That's his name, right? Albright?" "It is," Mrs. Parker confirmed. "I spoke to Mr. Thompson, and he told me how Mr. Albright used to feed the squirrels every morning. I think this squirrel was one of his regulars. Maybe it's been coming back all this time, looking for him. And now that we live here, it's leaving these acorns for us. Like it's trying to continue the routine." The family fell into a contemplative silence, each person processing the possibility that this tiny squirrel might be mourning its old friend, or at least continuing a tradition in his memory. It wasn't just delivering random acorns, it was trying to honor a bond it once shared with Mr. Albright. The realization left them all feeling a mixture of awe and sadness. "I wonder if there's more to this," Mr. Parker finally said. "What if this little guy is trying to tell us something? Maybe there's something important here that we're missing." The next day, the family decided to dig deeper, both literally and figuratively. They returned to the burrow where Mrs. Parker had found the acorn and the shiny object, bringing a small garden spade with them. Carefully, they began to dig around the burrow, uncovering more acorns and small trinkets the squirrel had likely been storing there for years. It was as if the animal had created a small treasure trove, hiding its collection of valuable items beneath the earth. After digging a little further, Mr. Parker struck something hard with the spade. He paused, exchanging a curious glance with his wife before carefully continuing. As they unearthed the object, they realized it was a small wooden box, worn and weathered, but still intact. It was hidden under layers of dirt and roots, as if it had been there for a long time. "What is this?" Mrs. Parker asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Parker carefully lifted the box from the ground, brushing off the dirt. The wood was rough to the touch, but the box itself seemed sturdy. With the kids watching in wide-eyed anticipation, he slowly opened the lid. Inside, they found a collection of old photographs, letters, and a few personal items that seemed to belong to Mr. Albright. The photographs depicted a much younger Mr. Albright, standing proudly outside the very house they now lived in. He was surrounded by wildlife, birds, squirrels, even a deer that appeared to frequent the yard. One photo, in particular, caught their attention. It was of Mr. Albright kneeling next to a tiny squirrel, holding out an acorn for it to take. The squirrel, standing on its hind legs, appeared to be the same one that had been visiting their house. The letters told stories of Mr. Albright's love for nature, how he found peace in his daily interactions with the animals, and how much he cherished the bond he had formed with the local wildlife. One letter, written to a friend, mentioned a specific squirrel he had nicknamed Chippy. In the letter, Mr. Albright described how Chippy would bring him acorns in exchange for food, as if they had made an unspoken agreement over time. The Parkers read through the letters with growing amazement. "Chippy must be the squirrel that's been visiting us," Mrs. Parker whispered. "He's still bringing acorns, just like he used to." By now, the family was emotionally invested in Chippy's story. They understood that the squirrel wasn't just following some random instinct, it was continuing a bond that had been forged with Mr. Albright years ago. The acorns weren't just gifts, they were symbols of a friendship that had transcended time and loss. Feeling a renewed sense of responsibility, the Parkers decided to honor Chippy's dedication. They started leaving small bowls of nuts and fruit outside every morning, just like Mr. Albright had done. The squirrel, true to form, continued to visit, dropping off an acorn each day before enjoying the treats the family left for him. It was as if Chippy had accepted the Parkers as the new stewards of his old routine, trusting them to carry on what Mr. Albright had started. The mystery of why the squirrel had brought acorns to their doorstep was finally solved, but it left the Parkers with a deeper understanding of the bonds that can exist between humans and animals. Chippy's loyalty to Mr. Albright had never wavered, even after all these years. And now, the Parker family felt honored to be part of that connection. In the weeks that followed, word of the squirrel's strange behavior spread through the neighborhood. Neighbors would occasionally stop by to watch Chippy's daily routine, marveling at the tiny creature's dedication. Some even brought small offerings of food, wanting to contribute to the ritual. The Parkers, once bemused by the squirrel's persistence, now felt a sense of pride in their unexpected role as Chippy's new caretakers. For them, it was more than just feeding a squirrel. It was about preserving a legacy, one that spoke to the quiet, unspoken bonds we share with the world around us. And in the end, it was about honoring the memory of a man who had understood the beauty in such simple, fleeting moments. Chippy continued to visit every day, always bringing his acorn, always receiving a gift in return. And though the Parkers knew they could never fully replace the bond he'd had with Mr. Albright, they were grateful for the chance to be a part of it, even if only for a little while longer. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell.